here with Stefan Hartmann, and I just have to tell you, your summit presentation was really quite successful. We got a lot of great feedback on it. So thank you so much for joining us for the Long COVID Reset Summit. And so I was really interested in just reconnecting with you to get a take on some other topics. And I know that you had prepared a presentation on the ancestral diet, which I myself am very interested in hearing about and learning more about, because I really do also kind of align with you on that kind of ancestral approach to health. So if you have a presentation, we can go ahead and share that on the screen.
Sure thing. Yeah, I'm glad to be back and talking about my favorite subject, ancestral diet and all things health optimization. Here we go. Ancestral diet. Let's start right on it. So I do house calls for my patients. It's oftentimes how I meet them. I go to their house and I do a kitchen inventory. Nice. So I go through their fridge, and I find this to be more accurate than any blood test, where I've gotten so good at it that I can look in their fridge and I know what their vitamin levels are going to be at. But this is pretty typical what you're seeing here. So highly processed foods, a lot of the seed oils, and they may not even know, I mean, you can obviously see a seed oil, corn oil there, the yellow liquid, but it's in a lot of their condiments in their fridge. And I would sometimes pull out, like, it'll cover their whole countertop, condiments, like so much condiment is in their fridge. And every one of these condiments is a cottonseed oil, corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, you name it. And people have no idea how much of this they're consuming. But besides that, their protein intake is super low. The protein quality is super low. And they're also consuming a large proportion of high fructose corn syrup and sugars. So if we're looking at root cause analysis for patients, you take a look at their fridge, you look at what they're eating, right? I talk a lot about this with my functional medicine colleagues. Like, we can talk about higher end peptides, methane blue, oxytocin, NAD, glutathione, right? Great supplements, right? But if they're eating garbage all day long, you can take all the nice quercetin and anti-aging supplements you want, but they're putting pollution into the body every day and have no nutrients. And sure, you can do a comprehensive Genova diagnostics analysis on these people. It's very expensive, but just, you know what their body's gonna be by looking at their fridge. But, you know, even outside of functional medicine, you know, even mainstream is getting on board with this. So the Lancet is saying that, hey, there's an epidemic of metabolic dysfunction, and it's probably not just calories in, calories out that's making people so sick, right? And metabolic dysfunction covers a whole process of diseases, from cancers, heart disease, and in my opinion, also the long COVID patient, both the vaccine injured and the wild type. I actually kind of stumbled upon this myself. I had what, in my opinion, was a bit of an autoimmune or arthritic type of condition. I had lateral epicondylitis. This is known as tennis elbow. And if you look at up to date, what causes tennis elbow, they say it's the novice tennis player. Well, I'm far from novice, right? I play professional tennis. I'm actually the North American Medical Tennis Championship. I'm the best tennis playing medical professional there is currently, all right? Until they have another tournament, and then I'll see if I can beat them again. Mm-hmm. So it's not a novice. So what is the cause of my tennis elbow? Well, I did the conventional treatment, right? I did ibuprofens. I did the rehab for this, the icing. It didn't work. You know, it pretty much ended my tennis career. But I figured out that the ancestral diet could fix this for myself. And it was cutting out a lot of the junk I was consuming. I was unaware of this back in my early college days. You know, I was eating the conventional diet, a lot of bread products. You know, they told you needed to carb fill with gluten to performance and all that stuff. And I had no idea what a seed oil was back then. It wasn't on my radar. But there's a lot of practical reasons towards why I recommend the ancestral diet for patients. And the most practical reason is it reduces the amount of supplements they're having to consume every day. And it's cheap, right? You can get all your nutrients and vitamins if you eat the ancestral diet. And so it's way affordable. I do work with a low income population here in Melbourne, and not all my patients can afford, you know, Quicksilver Scientific supplements. But besides that, the ancestral diet, it reduces the toxic load that's on these people's bodies. The hateful eight seed oils, canola, cottonseed, safflower oil, they're pro-oxidant, they're pro-inflammatory. They're also endocrine disruptors. They lower men's testosterone. They're estrogen mimickers, specifically the soybean oil types. And there's just so much pollution that people are putting onto the body. They're doing cologne every day. They're doing deodorants, and they're using fragrances. And we know fragrances, these are not FDA controlled or USDA approved. We don't know what you're getting with a fragrance. They're getting food coloring and dyes. It just adds to their toxic burden. And don't even get me started on the sunscreen that everyone's lathering onto their bodies, right? I tell my patients this, I was like, I prescribe testosterone replacement therapy. A very effective way of delivering testosterone to the body is a topical application of testosterone. It gets absorbed through the skin. Now, what do you think happens with sunscreen? It gets absorbed through the skin. Now, in testosterone, we want that to cause an effect, and it has a lot of beneficial effects on the body. But what happens when you apply sunscreen into the skin and it disappears after 60 minutes and you have to reapply it? Well, it's also causing an effect on the body, and we really don't know what it's doing, but it's been pulled off the shelves multiple times for cancer-causing properties.
You know, what's confusing to a lot of people is there's a heart healthy, like American Medical Association or American Heart Association label on a lot of the seed oils, you know, like especially canola oil for a long time.
And we're gonna get to that, and we're gonna see that even the American College of Cardiology is starting to wake up on this. So there's been increasing alarm that some of these vegetable oils are not so healthy. And one of the most important things, you can run these panels on patients. They're called omega-3 to omega-6 ratios, or omega quants. You can get it done, not too expensive, Quest, LabCorp. You can see what the ratios are at. But I don't run these too often. I just know that they're eating a lot of omega-6s, right? So we try to reduce that best we can. And some practitioners in functional medicine, they believe in supplementing omega-3s, and that's a great way to improve the ratio. And we do that in the long COVID protocol, omega-3s. But another way to do that is just reduce the amount of omega-6s you're consuming. And we'll see in a little bit, I have a chart on how potent these are. So we have here a cool graph of the overall incidence of seed oil consumption over the past, let's see, this goes back 100 years. We can see that actually saturated fat has kind of dropped off over time. And really these seed oils have increased in the consumption rates, soybean oil in particular. Now we can say correlation doesn't equal causation, but we just have to look to the farmers, our good farmer friends, and they know very well that the addition of soybean oil significantly improves the body weight of broilers during the total and growth rearing periods. So farmers know if you want to fatten up your chicken, you feed it soybean oil, right? But somehow we can't apply this to humans, although we know that all of our drugs are initially done trials on the animal models. So we can extrapolate this to humans, maybe put 2 and 2 together here. But we kind of got into this whole mess of the seed oils and the healthy food pyramid. It started in the 1960s when vegetable oil and margarine producers exploited the AMA's consequent recommendation to replace butter and lard with vegetable oil. And there was a lot of momentum behind this. The history is kind of interesting. There was the heart attack by Dwight D. Eisenhower that kind of put it into a media sensation of what's causing heart attacks. And then there was some studies that we'll see a little bit later that kind of misrepresented saturated fat and the associations with heart disease. So there's like 100-year momentum behind this. It's very difficult to shift public opinion on this. But I think the year 2023 will be the paradigm shift, and seed oils will be now mainstream known as not so good for you. You can just look at how these things are made in the factory. So this is an example of what is canola oil, but canola oil doesn't actually exist. That's actually good branding. It's actually rapeseed oil. So rapeseed oil is actually a machine lubricant that was used during World War II for the battleships and weapons. This was a Canadian export. Now, Canada had a surplus of this after World War II. And then what did they do? Well, rapeseed oil doesn't sound politically correct. So they rebranded it as Canada Oil. And so we got canola oil. All right. And that's how that came to the US. Big export, Canada. But the way that's processed, it's highly heated. So when you overheat any oil, even olive oil is great for you. But if you nuke this thing with heat, it turns into a bit of a pro-oxidant, right? You get these free radical formations. This is a fancy term that people like to throw around, but if it's simple enough, is what happens is the carbon chain kind of breaks, and then you get this hydrogen atom, it pops off, and this hydrogen atom, it can bond to things, this carbon chain, it becomes a bit oxidized. You can mutate DNA that way. And look at this chart here. I really like this chart. It's the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And you can see, you can take all the fish oil you want to try to balance this ratio. But if you're consuming something like, say, soybean oil that has 50,293 milligrams of omega-6 to 7,000 milligrams of omega-3, it's very difficult to balance this, right? And I see some influencers on Instagram saying that, oh, canola oil has omega-3s. Well, yeah, it does have some omega-3s, but it also has a lot of omega-6s. And if you're trying to balance this, you want to potentially reduce these highly, and don't even get me started on grapeseed oil and sunflower oil and cottonseed oil. Cottonseed oil is probably the worst offender with 51,000 milligrams of omega-6 to only 200 milligrams of omega-3s. It's very difficult to beat this one with fish oil supplementation, although fish oil supplementation is great. But the fish matters as well. So the farm-raised salmon is fed actually seeds and vegetable oils. So you can actually make the meat profile of the salmon high omega-6. So it's no longer good for you omega-3 fatty fish. It's farm-raised omega-6 fatty fish. So the quality of the meat matters as well.
And the same goes for things that we don't normally consider high in omega-3s. We can raise their omega-3 levels, like for beef, for example. You can improve the omega-3 kind of.
So I have chickens in my backyard, and I just feed them a non-seed oil grain. I try to get them bugs. I try to get them even meat. You know, my chickens are meat eaters. People think they're vegetarians. They're not. They love meat. If I give them beef liver, they'll gobble it up raw. Oh yeah. And we'll get to the beef thing later too. I have a very interesting point on that. So let's talk about the American College of Cardiology. I mean, this came out in about 2020 and it kind of flew under the radar, but they said that they've perhaps been wrong for the past 40 years and that the standard lipid panel doesn't adequately assess cardiac disease and that maybe the size of the LDL particles are more important. Even the Brits are onto this as well. They say saturated fat does not clog arteries. Coronary heart disease is a chronic inflammatory condition, the risk of which can be effectively reduced with healthy lifestyle interventions. This is 2017 BMJ. So this is our big journals, our big, ivory tower researchers that are saying this, but it's not getting the press coverage that we need. So I have a bit of a protocol. I send this to all my patients. I have beef liver pate recipes, how to make this. At the end of this lecture, I have some links. You can follow my fiance's cooking channel on Instagram. She shows people how to make ancestrally appropriate foods. Tasty too. Beef liver tastes amazing if you make the recipe right. We have some recommendations for pasture and free-range organic eggs. So this is the ideal type of chicken egg. Chickens, unfortunately, are often fed a processed food diet to make them fat, as we alluded to earlier. So getting a high-quality chicken is better. I prefer patients, if they can't get a high-quality chicken, to just eat beef. Even if it's not a grass-fed beef, the cow has multiple stomachs, so they process out glyphosate and things a little bit better. I make a point to my patients to consume fruit that's seasonal and fruit that's organically raised. You know, again, because of the glyphosate problem, we know the problem with glyphosate. It's a mutagen. It's pro-inflammatory. So, you know, I tell my patients, if you can't buy organic or regeneratively raised fruits and vegetables, skip it and just focus on the meats. You're going to get more bang for your buck there and less glyphosate. Here's also my point about calories in and calories out. So here you're kind of looking at 197 grams of protein. So for me, that's 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So what I do is protein leveraging. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, why that's important for the elderly population. It's very easy to maintain weight if you protein leverage, so increase the amount of protein you're consuming. We know very well that low carbohydrate, higher fats diets are good, but I'd like to point out a couple studies here that they're actually equivalent or better than the calorie in, calorie out manipulation for weight loss. And we know getting weight off our patients will reduce their inflammatory burden, less fat cells, less inflammation. And we know COVID and long COVID is an inflammatory disease. So getting the weight off patients is key. But these low carbohydrate, high fat diets are pretty good, even I'd say better or equal to calorie in, calorie. Now, calories in, calories out still matters, and you can definitely overeat on a low carbohydrate, higher fat diet, but it's easier to maintain this diet than telling a patient to count all their calories. But specifically for improving their metabolic profile, I like to point out this study that the low carbohydrate diet, it increases the LDL size. And if we remember what the American College of Cardiology said earlier, is that the size of the LDLs matters a little bit better. It decreases small and dense LDL particles, which are more pathologic for arterial disease. And they found a more protective LDL pattern A in the low carbohydrate group. I knew you can look at these patterns with the NMR or cardio IQ, and you can see what your patients are trending towards it. But for the most part, what I see in patients on the SAD diet, the standard American diet, is pattern B types pretty routinely. I also like to point out higher protein diets. So people think, oh, a high protein diet, you can't do that for a diseased population. Well, look at this study here, the PRO-HEART trial. And they didn't even do that high protein, in my opinion. They only did like a 30% protein diet, which I guess that's like, whoa, that's a lot of protein for someone with heart failure. But if you give someone a higher protein diet, they actually do better. Their outcomes are better. They have reduced weight and visceral fat, and they have greater reduction of cardiometabolic risks relative to the standard protein diet. So recommendations typically are like, only 15% protein, okay? But this is not holding up to any sort of research coming out. And then I get to sarcopenia, which is an epidemic in all our patients. Specifically, I find the long COVID patient. They have low muscle mass. They have a lot of fat mass. They have fatty infiltrates. You can look at this under MRI if you get an MRI of your patient. I've even found that POCUS, so point of care ultrasound, Ultrasound Pro, I can look at their calf muscle. If I look at the calf muscle and it shows brightness, that means their muscle is streaked with fat. And I might do a YouTube video on this. I'll look at a Wagyu beef, and Wagyu beef is full of fatty infiltrates in the muscle. But this is what most of the American population is. 88%, I've seen as high as 92% are metabolically unhealthy. And this is essentially poor muscle tone. It's muscle streaked with fat, or muscle being replaced with fat. And that's sarcopenia. That's what we're dealing with here in a lot of the patient populations. So how do you fix this? You eat more protein intake, you do resistance training, you eat the ancestral diet, right? We don't see sarcopenia in primitive peoples, right? They're lean, they're muscular, their carbohydrate intake, at least in the tribes, as we will see later, that aren't exposed to the white man's diet, they don't have metabolic disease. But can a vegan diet reverse sarcopenia? Again, I see this on social media. Some vegan influencers, they say vegan diet, that's the way you reverse metabolic disease. And so not the case. If we're looking at it from a muscle centric medicine approach, if you're doing high vegan diet, this is low protein intake, or low quality protein intake, I should say, right? Plant-based protein is not the same as meat-based protein.